The blood-soaked telegram trembled in Zara Keller's hands as she stood in the doorway of her family's modest cabin, the Montana Territory wilderness stretching endlessly around her. Her father was dead. At 22, she was now alone in the world, with nothing but a remote homestead and crushing grief to keep her company. May 1876. 3 weeks had passed since that telegram arrived, and Zara sat on her porch, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. Her blonde hair, usually neatly pinned, hung loose around her shoulders. The homestead felt emptier than ever. Her father had been gone often, sometimes for months at a time, working whatever jobs he could find to keep their small ranch afloat, but this was different. The permanence of death was a weight she couldn't shake. A movement on the horizon caught her eye. A lone rider approached, his silhouette shimmering in the late spring heat. Zara stood, hand instinctively reaching for her father's old rifle propped against the wall. Living alone on the frontier had quickly taught her caution. As the rider drew closer, she could make out his features. Tall and lean, with a weathered face that suggested he'd spent his years under the harsh western sun. His clothes were trail-worn but neat, and he rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Afternoon, madam," he called, stopping his horse a respectful distance from her porch. His voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder. "Name's Yates Wade. I was a friend of your father's." Zara kept the rifle visible but lowered it slightly. "My father had many friends, Mr. Wade. I don't recall him mentioning you." A sad smile crossed the stranger's face. "We rode together up in the Dakota Territory last winter. I was with him when—" He paused, removed his hat. "When he got hurt, he asked me to check on you, make sure you were managing all right." "I'm managing fine," Zara replied, her voice cooler than she intended. "Thank you for your concern." Yates nodded, his eyes a striking shade of green that reminded her of summer grass taking in the state of the homestead. The barn needed repair, fence posts were leaning, and the garden her mother had once tended was now just a patch of weeds. "Your father spoke highly of you," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "Said you were as stubborn as him, twice as smart." Despite herself, Zara felt her throat tighten. That sounded like her father. "I've got nowhere particular to be," Yates continued. "I could help with some repairs around here before moving on. No charge, just keeping a promise to a good man." Zara hesitated. She needed help, God knows she did, but trusting a stranger went against everything her father had taught her about survival in this untamed country. "I can sleep in the barn," he added, as if reading her thoughts. "And you can keep that rifle handy if it makes you feel better." "Why would you do that? Help a stranger? Like I said, your father was a friend, and out here, folks help each other." He dismounted with fluid grace. "Besides, I was heading this way anyhow." Something in his earnest expression made Zara nod. "1 week," she said firmly, "then we'll see." Yates Wade's week turned into 2, then a month. He repaired the barn, mended fences, and helped Zara tend to the small herd of cattle her father had left behind. Each morning, he'd be up before the sun, working tirelessly until dusk. Each night, he returned to the barn without complaint. Zara found herself watching him as he worked, noting the careful precision of his hands as he built or fixed things. He wasn't much for idle talk, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. She learned he'd been riding the frontier since he was 16, had fought briefly in the war, and had tried his hand at everything from cattle driving to gold prospecting. "Never found much gold," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. "Found plenty of trouble, though." "What kind of trouble?" Zara asked, finding herself curious about this quiet man. He shrugged, his eyes on the setting sun. "The usual kind, men who want what's not theirs, towns that don't take kindly to strangers, winters that try to kill you. And yet you keep moving." "Haven't found a reason to stop," he said simply, then looked at her with those green eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to show. "Until now, maybe." Heat rose to Zara's cheeks and she turned away. "I should check on the bread for tomorrow." As May turned to June, Zara noticed Yates clearing a patch of ground near the cabin. When she asked what he was doing, he merely said, "You'll see." Each morning before his other chores, he'd work on that patch of earth, tilling and turning it. One morning she brought him coffee and found him planting something in the freshly prepared soil. "Seeds," he explained, holding out his palm to show her tiny specks. "Wildflowers, mostly, some herbs too. A garden." Zara couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Why?" Yates continued planting, his movements methodical. "Your father told me about your mother's garden, how she always kept flowers around the place, said it was the one thing that made this harsh country feel like home." Tears pricked at Zara's eyes. Her mother had died when she was 12, but she remembered the garden vibrant and alive, a splash of color against the rugged landscape. After her death, her father had let it go, unable to maintain that particular reminder of his loss, I thought. Yates hesitated, looking suddenly uncertain. "I thought you might like to have that again." Without thinking, Zara reached out and touched his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. "Thank you," she whispered. The touch lingered between them, electric and uncertain, before Yates cleared his throat and returned to his planting. That night, for the first time, Zara invited him to eat supper inside the cabin rather than taking his plate to the barn. They talked late into the evening, and she found herself laughing for the first time since her father's death. As June progressed, so did the garden. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, reaching for the sun. Yates tended them with surprising gentleness for such a rugged man, watering them carefully each morning and evening. "Never figured you for a gardener," Zara remarked one day as she watched him work. He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. "My mother kept a garden. Not much else grew where I came from in Texas, but she could make flowers bloom in sand. You miss her every day," he said quietly. "She died when I was 14. Fever took her. I'm sorry." It was a long time ago. He stood, brushing soil from his hands. "But her garden, that's a good memory. Thought maybe this could be one for you too." The simple thoughtfulness of it touched something deep inside Zara. Since her father's death, she'd been focused solely on survival, on keeping the homestead running. Yates had brought beauty back into her life, a luxury she'd forgotten she needed. July brought scorching heat and the first blooms in the garden. Simple wildflowers at first, bluebells and daisies, but they transformed the front of the cabin. Zara found herself cutting small bunches to place in jars around the house, filling the rooms with color and subtle fragrance. They worked side by side now, establishing a routine. Mornings for chores, afternoons for repairs or tending the cattle, evenings for rest. Yates no longer slept in the barn but in a small room off the kitchen that had once been her father's. One hot afternoon, they rode out together to check on cattle grazing in the western pasture. A sudden summer storm rolled in, forcing them to take shelter in an old line shack. Rain hammered on the tin roof as they huddled inside, watching lightning crack across the sky. "Reminds me of Texas storms," Yates said, his voice barely audible above the downpour. "They'd come out of nowhere, turn the world sideways." Zara nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Despite the summer heat, the rain had brought a chill. Without a word, Yates removed his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. The warmth of him lingered in the fabric, and his scent leather and pine and something uniquely him surrounded her. "Thank you," she said softly. "Can't have you catching cold," he replied, his voice suddenly gruff. "Who'd keep me in line?" Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. The air in the small shack seemed to thicken. Yates moved first, taking a deliberate step back, turning to stare out at the rain. "I should check on the horses," he said, and stepped outside before she could respond. Zara watched through the open door as he moved through the downpour, his shirt immediately soaking through, clinging to the contours of his back. Her heart raced, and she pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm it. She was falling in love with him, she realized with startling clarity. The knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. The storm passed, and they rode back to the cabin in comfortable silence, but something had changed. There was an awareness between them now, a current that hadn't been there before. August brought golden days, and the garden reached its full glory. Zara had added her own touch as stone borders collected from the creek bed, a small bench Yates had built so she could sit among the blooms. The garden had become their shared project, a living symbol of how they'd brought the homestead back to life together. On a particularly beautiful evening, Zara sat on the bench, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Yates found her there, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, handing her a steaming cup. She accepted it with a smile. "I was thinking about my father, how he'd hardly recognize this place now. You think he'd approve of the garden?" "Absolutely." She took a sip of coffee. "Of you, I'm not so sure. He was protective." Yates chuckled, settling beside her on the bench. "Most fathers are." "Were you ever married, Yates?" The question had been on her mind for weeks. He shook his head. "No, came close once, but she chose a banker instead, probably for the best. A drifter doesn't make for a steady husband." "But you're not drifting anymore," Zara said softly. "You've been here almost 4 months now." Their eyes met over the coffee cups. "No," he agreed quietly, "I'm not drifting anymore." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Yates leaned forward slightly, then seemed to catch himself. He stood abruptly. "I should finish mending that plow before dark," he said, and walked away, leaving Zara alone with her racing heart and jumbled thoughts. That night, a commotion in the yard woke them. 3 riders, clearly drunk and looking for trouble, had decided the isolated cabin was an easy target. Zara stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, as Yates confronted them. "This property is protected," he called out, his own gun at his side. "Move on." The leader of the group, a burly man with a matted beard, sneered. "Protected by who?" "You and the little lady. We outnumber you, friend." "Numbers aren't everything," Yates replied calmly, "and I'm not your friend." Zara stepped forward, rifle raised. "My father was Thaddeus Keller. Some of you might have heard of him." The mention of her father's name caused a visible shift in the rider's demeanor. Thaddeus Keller had been known throughout the territory as a man not to be crossed. Keller's daughter. The leader looked uncertain now. "Nobody said nothing about this being Keller land." "Well, it is," she said firmly. "And now you know." The men exchanged glances, their bravado deflating. Without another word, they turned their horses and rode off into the night. When they were gone, Zara's knees began to shake. The rifle felt suddenly heavy in her hands. Yates was at her side in an instant, gently taking the weapon from her. "You were brave," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I was terrified. Bravery isn't about not feeling fear, it's about facing it." He guided her back inside, his hand steady on her elbow. "Your father would be proud." In the soft lamplight of the cabin, with the night still dark around them and danger freshly retreated, the barriers between them finally fell. Yates's hand moved from her elbow to her face, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Zara," he whispered, her name a question and a plea. She answered by rising onto her tiptoes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with months of unspoken longing. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. She wound her fingers through his hair, letting herself be swept away by the feeling. When they finally parted, both breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I rode up to your porch," he admitted. Zara laughed softly. "Even when I was pointing a rifle at you, especially then," he grinned. "You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." They spent the rest of the night talking, really talking about everything, their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Dawn found them still awake, sitting close together on the porch, watching the first light touch the garden Yates had planted for her. "I love you," he said simply as the sun crested the horizon. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but there it is." Zara took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I love you too." September brought cooling temperatures and a decision. Yates asked Zara to marry him one evening as they worked side by side in the garden, preparing it for the coming fall. "I know I'm not the kind of man your father might have chosen for you," he said, kneeling in the soil before her, a small silver ring his mother's held out in offering. "I don't have much to my name, but I love you, Zara Keller, and if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret it." Tears spilled down Zara's cheeks as she nodded, too overcome to speak at first. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch. The garden provided flowers for Zara's hair and the simple bouquet she carried. Neighbors from miles around came to witness the union and celebrate afterward with food and music under the stars. As they danced that night, surrounded by well-wishers, Yates held her close. "Are you happy?" he murmured against her hair. Zara looked up at him, at this man who had ridden into her life and changed everything. "Happier than I ever thought possible. The years that followed were not always easy." The Montana Territory was still wild, still demanding. Winters were harsh and the work never ended, but they faced it together. They expanded the ranch, built a larger cabin when their family began to grow. First came their son, James, born in the summer of 1878, with his father's green eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, they welcomed twin girls, Emma and Elizabeth, who toddled through the garden as soon as they could walk. Fascinated by the butterflies that danced among the blooms through it all, Yates continued to tend the garden, expanding it each year. It became known throughout the region, Zara's garden. People called it a riot of color and life in the midst of the rugged landscape. In 1883, when Montana was still 7 years from statehood, they faced their greatest challenge. A drought year followed by a brutal winter threatened everything they'd built. Cattle died, crops failed, and for a time it seemed they might lose the ranch. One particularly desperate night, Zara found Yates sitting alone on the garden bench, despite the biting cold. "We'll get through this," she said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "We always do." He looked at her, his face lined now with years of sun and worry, but his eyes still bright with love. "I know, as long as we're together, we'll find a way," and they did. Spring came, bringing rain and renewal. The garden bloomed again, more vibrant than ever, as if defying the hardships they'd endured. As their children grew, so did the ranch and their standing in the community. Yates, once a drifter with nowhere to call home, became a respected rancher and eventually served as county commissioner when Montana achieved statehood in 1889. Zara established a small school on their property, ensuring their children and those of neighboring ranches received an education. Through the changing seasons of their lives, the garden remained constant, a living testament to their love and resilience. Each bloom spoke of promises kept, of beauty nurtured in harsh conditions, of a drifter who found his home in a woman's heart. In the summer of 1896, 20 years after Yates first rode up to Zara's cabin, they sat together on the garden bench that had been replaced several times over the years. Their children were nearly grown, James preparing to attend university back east, the twins blossoming into young women with suitors calling regularly. "Did you ever imagine this?" Zara asked, her head resting on Yates's shoulder as they watched the sunset, a ritual they'd maintained through 2 decades together. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted, his arm secure around her waist. "I was just trying to keep a promise to your father when I rode in that day." Zara looked up at him curiously. "You never did tell me exactly what you promised him." Yates smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "He made me swear I'd look after you, said you were too stubborn to ask for help even if you needed it." "That sounds like him," Zara laughed. "But you did more than look after me. You gave me a life I never could have imagined." "You did the same for me," Yates replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was lost before I found you." As twilight deepened around them, they remained in the garden, surrounded by the flowers he had planted so she would always have beauty in her life. Neither could have known on that first meeting how completely their lives would intertwine, how deeply they would root themselves in each other's hearts. Through the years, The garden had weathered storms and droughts, just as their love had endured challenges and hardships. Some seasons brought abundant blooms, others just a few hardy blossoms fighting through difficult conditions. But it had never failed to flower, never failed to remind them of what they had built together. "I think we should expand the garden again next spring," Yates said as stars began to appear above them. "Add those roses you've been wanting." Zara smiled up at him. "Always planning for the future, aren't you?" "Our future," he corrected, squeezing her hand. "And I intend for us to have many more years of it." The next morning, Zara woke to find the bed beside her empty. She dressed quickly and went searching for Yates, eventually finding him in the garden, already working despite the early hour. He was marking out a new section, adding to the already impressive space. "Couldn't wait until spring?" she asked, amused. He looked up with a boyish grin that never failed to make her heart flutter, even after all these years. "Got to thinking last night about those roses. Figured I'd get a head start." She knelt beside him, not minding the dirt on her skirt. "Let me help." Together they worked the soil, their movements in perfect harmony after years of shared labor. Their hands, both calloused and weathered now, occasionally brushed against each other, each touch still sending a pleasant warmth through Zara. "Remember when you first started this garden?" she asked as they worked. "Like it was yesterday," Yates replied. "You looked at me like I'd lost my mind, digging in the dirt when there was real work to be done." "And now look at us," Zara laughed. "The whole county knows about this garden. People bring their courting sweethearts here to walk among the flowers." It was true. Over the years, their garden had become something of a local landmark. Young men would ask permission to bring their ladies to see the famous blooms, especially when Yates's prized lilies were flowering or when the wildflowers painted the ground in a riot of color. "Speaking of courtship," Yates said, his tone deliberately casual. "I saw young Thomas Miller looking at Emma again at church on Sunday." Zara sighed. "She's too young. She's 18, same age you were when your father left you to manage this ranch on your own." "That was different," Zara protested weakly. "Times were different." Yates set down his trowel and turned to face her fully. "The years go by faster than we think, my love. Seems like just yesterday you were threatening me with that rifle of yours, and now our children are starting their own lives." There was a touch of melancholy in his voice that resonated with Zara's own feelings. Their lives had been so consumed with building something lasting, with surviving and then thriving in this demanding land, that sometimes it seemed the years had slipped through their fingers like water. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Stopping here, building this life instead of continuing to explore?" Yates looked surprised at the question. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "Every morning I wake up beside you, I thank whatever fortune brought me to your door." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair now streaked with silver from her face. "Besides, we did plenty of exploring, just a different kind. We explored what it means to build something together, to raise children, to weather storms both real and figurative." Zara leaned into his touch. "We certainly did." A call from the house interrupted them, James, announcing that breakfast was ready. They rose together, brushing soil from their clothes before heading back. The kitchen was warm and filled with morning light as their family gathered around the large table Yates had built when the twins were born. James, now a strapping young man of 18 with his father's height and his mother's quick mind, was eagerly discussing his plans for university. The twins, Emma and Elizabeth, were setting out plates, their blonde heads bent together in quiet conversation. Zara felt a rush of gratitude as she looked at her family. This moment, this life would have seemed impossible to the scared, grieving young woman she'd been when Yates first arrived. After breakfast, as the children dispersed to their chores, Yates pulled Zara aside. "I have something to show you," he said, a hint of mystery in his voice. "Come with me." He led her to the barn, to the far corner where he kept his tools and personal items. From a locked trunk he withdrew a package wrapped in oilcloth. "What's this?" Zara asked as he handed it to her. Open it, he urged. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal. Opening it, she recognized her father's handwriting immediately. Her breath caught. Where did you get this? She whispered. Your father gave it to me, Yates explained quietly. When he knew he wasn't going to make it, he wanted you to have it, but not until the right time. And now is the right time, Yates nodded. Read the last entry. With trembling fingers, Zara turned to the final pages of her father's journal. The handwriting was shakier than the earlier entries, evidence of the injury that would eventually take his life. Met a man named Yates Wade today, she read aloud. Different from most drifters. Has a steadiness about him, a quiet strength. Reminds me of myself at that age. Told him about Zara, about the ranch. If I don't make it back, I think he might be the kind of man who could help her. Not just with the work, Zara can manage that, but with the loneliness. The kind of man who might plant flowers where others would see only dirt. Tears filled Zara's eyes. He knew, she whispered. Somehow, he knew you'd be the one. Yates wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she clutched the journal to her chest. He made me promise to wait before giving this to you, said I'd know when the time was right. And why now? Zara asked, looking up at him. Because today marks 20 years since I first laid eyes on you, he said softly. 20 years since I started falling in love with the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Zara hadn't realized the significance of the date. So many years, so many memories they sometimes blurred together. But Yates had remembered. Thank you, she said, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. For remembering, for staying, for the garden. Always, he promised, the word an echo of thousands of similar promises made over their years together. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, they sat on their porch, looking out at the garden silhouetted in the moonlight. Yates's arm was around her shoulders, and Zara's head rested against him, their bodies fitting together with the familiar comfort of long companionship. I've been thinking, Yates said, breaking the companionable silence. About that trip we always talked about taking. Zara looked up at him. To the coast, you're serious? They had often spoken of traveling to California, of seeing the Pacific Ocean, but the demands of the ranch and raising children had always made it seem like a distant dream. James will be off to university soon. The twins are old enough to manage things for a few weeks with help from the hands. Yates squeezed her shoulder. I think it's time we had an adventure, just the two of us. The idea sent a thrill through Zara. I'd like that, she said, snuggling closer to him. Very much. Then it's settled, Yates declared. Next spring, after the planting, we'll go see that ocean. They continued to sit together as the night deepened around them, making plans and sharing memories. The garden Yates had planted all those years ago stretched before them, a living testament to their enduring love. True to his word, they made the journey to California the following spring. The Pacific Ocean was even more magnificent than they had imagined, vast and powerful. They walked along the shore, collected shells, and watched the sun set over the water, marveling at how different it was from their Montana sunsets. It's beautiful, Zara said as they stood with their feet in the surf, waves lapping at their ankles, but I miss our garden. Yates looked down at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. So do I, he admitted. Ready to go home, she nodded, and they made their way back to Montana, to the life they had built together, to the garden that had started it all. The years continued to pass. Their children grew fully into adulthood, pursuing their own paths. James became a lawyer and eventually a state judge, married with children of his own. Elizabeth surprised everyone by taking over management of the ranch operations, proving to have a keen head for business. Emma, the more artistic of the twins, opened a photography studio in the growing town nearby, documenting the changing frontier. Through it all, Yates and Zara remained the heart of the family, the steady center around which the younger generations revolved. And always, there was the garden, expanding and evolving but always blooming, always reminding them of their beginning. In the autumn of 1906, 30 years after Yates first rode up to Zara's door, they celebrated their anniversary with a gathering that brought their entire extended family back to the ranch. Grandchildren ran through the garden paths, their laughter echoing across the years. As evening fell and the younger family members took the celebration inside, Yates and Zara remained in the garden, sitting on the newest incarnation of their bench. His hair was fully silver now, her once blonde tresses faded to a soft white. The years had left their mark on both of them, in the lines on their faces and the occasional stiffness in their joints. But their eyes, when they looked at each other, still held the same light. 30 years, Zara mused, her hand entwined with his. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime. Both, I think, Yates replied, but I wouldn't trade a single day of it, not even the hard ones, especially not the hard ones, he said firmly. They made the good days all the sweeter. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their family inside the house, their legacy, living and breathing. Around them, the garden was preparing for winter, the blooms fading but still beautiful in their autumn colors. You know, Yates said thoughtfully, when I planted that first garden, I never imagined all that would grow from it, not just the flowers, but everything else, our family, our life together. Zara leaned against him, savoring his solid presence. You planted more than flowers that day, Yates Wade. You planted hope, and look how it's bloomed. He kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her. And it will keep blooming long after we're gone. It was true. The garden had become a family tradition. James's wife had started a similar one at their home in Helena. The twins each tended their own plots, inspired by the one their father had created. Even the grandchildren were learning to plant and care for flowers, guided by Yates's patient hands. As the evening stars appeared overhead, Yates and Zara remained in the garden, two figures silhouetted against the twilight, their lives as intertwined as the plants around them. Their story, which began with a lone rider approaching a grieving woman's homestead, had flourished into something neither could have imagined. The garden Yates had planted beside the cabin, so Zara would always have flowers, had given her far more than blooms. It had given her a lifetime of love, a family, a home in the truest sense of the word. And as they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the garden of their making, both knew with absolute certainty that they had found something rare and precious. A love that, like the perennial flowers they tended, returned season after season, weathering whatever storms came their way, always finding its way back to the light. The following morning, as was their custom, they rose early and walked through the garden together, discussing plans for the next season's planting. Despite their age, both still worked the soil themselves, finding peace in the connection with the earth and with each other. I think we should try those new rose varieties next spring, Yates suggested as they paused to admire a late blooming patch of asters. The ones in that catalog James brought from back east. Zara smiled, watching her husband's face as he envisioned yet another enhancement to their decades-old garden. His enthusiasm for it had never dimmed. Always planning ahead, she teased gently, echoing words she'd spoken many times over their years together. Yates caught her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that still made her heart quicken, even after all these years. Someone has to, he replied with a wink. As they continued their morning ritual, their oldest granddaughter, Catherine James's daughter, came running through the garden paths to find them. At 16, she was the image of her grandmother in her youth, with the same determined set to her jaw and direct gaze. "Grandma, Grandpa." "You have visitors," she announced, slightly breathless. "It's a man from that magazine, the one that wants to write about your garden." Zara and Yates exchanged surprised glances. Months earlier, a representative from a national gardening publication had approached them about featuring their creation in an article. The Montana garden had gained regional fame over the decades, but national attention was unexpected. "Well, I suppose we should make ourselves presentable," Yates said, brushing soil from his hands. Can't have people thinking we're just a couple of old dirt farmers. Catherine giggled. You could never be just farmers, Grandpa, you're legends. The legend comment made them both laugh as they made their way back to the house, where a well-dressed gentleman with a notebook and a photographer with a bulky camera waited. The interview lasted most of the morning, with the journalist asking detailed questions about how the garden had been established and maintained in such a challenging climate. Yates, normally reserved with strangers, became animated as he explained his techniques, the special care certain plants required, the years of trial and error. "And why did you start this garden, Mr. Wade?" the journalist asked. "It seems an unusual undertaking for a cattleman in such remote country." Yates glanced at Zara, his eyes softening. "I planted it for her," he said simply, "so she would always have flowers." The journalist looked between them, sensing there was more to the story. "That's quite romantic." "Was this a courting gesture?" "In a way," Zara answered, her hand finding Yates's, though neither of us realized it at the time. They shared the condensed version of their story, how Yates had arrived to help after her father's death, how the garden had been his way of bringing beauty back to her life, how it had grown along with their love and family. The photographer captured images of them among the blooms, of the garden itself, and of the original cabin still standing, though no longer their primary residence. The main house had been built 20 years earlier to accommodate their growing family, but they had preserved the cabin where their story began. After the visitors departed, promising to send a copy of the magazine when the article was published, Yates and Zara returned to the garden for their usual evening sit. "Imagine that," Yates mused. "Our garden in a magazine that people will read clear across the country." "It's your garden," Zara corrected gently. "You're the one with the gift." He shook his head. "No, it's ours, always has been." He took her hand, his thumb tracing over the wedding band he'd placed there 3 decades ago. "Everything I've ever done worth doing, I've done with you, Zara." The magazine article appeared 3 months later, featuring several pages of photographs and a glowing account of the Montana Miracle Garden, as they called it. The piece described not just the horticultural achievement, but the love story behind it, portraying Yates and Zara as pioneers who had brought beauty to the wilderness through dedication and partnership. Copies were requested by friends and neighbors, and for a brief time, they experienced a small measure of fame. Occasionally, travelers would go out of their way to see the famous garden, and Zara and Yates would graciously show them around, sharing their knowledge and stories. But fame was fleeting, as they knew it would be, and life soon returned to its comfortable rhythm. The seasons continued to turn, bringing the constant cycle of planting and growth, bloom and dormancy that had structured their lives together. Winter came again, harsh as Montana winters always were, but their home was warm and filled with family as Christmas approached. All 3 of their children returned, bringing spouses and children of their own. The house rang with laughter and conversation. With music from the piano Yates had surprised Zara with on their 20th anniversary, with the patter of small feet as the youngest grandchildren chased each other through the rooms. On Christmas Eve, after the younger generations had gone to bed, Yates and Zara sat by the fire in the parlor, a rare moment of quiet amid the holiday bustle. "I have something for you," Yates said, reaching into his pocket. "I wanted to give it to you privately." He handed her a small package wrapped in silver paper. Zara opened it carefully to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a pressed flower, a tiny blue forget-me-not from their garden, preserved between glass. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touching the flower gently. "I pressed it last summer," Yates explained. "Thought you might like a piece of the garden to carry with you, even in winter." Zara leaned over to kiss him, her heart full. "Help me put it on." Yates fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin with familiar tenderness. "There," he said, sitting back to admire it. "Perfect." She touched the locket where it rested against her collarbone. I have something for you too, she said, reaching for a wrapped package she'd hidden behind a cushion. It's not as beautiful as this, but Yates unwrapped the gift to reveal a leather-bound book. Opening it, he found pages of pressed flowers, one from each year of their garden, carefully labeled with dates and notes in Zara's neat handwriting. I've been pressing them since that first summer, she explained. Just one bloom from each year. I thought it was time to give them to you. Yates's eyes grew misty as he turned the pages, each flower a memory, a milestone in their shared life. This, he said hoarsely, is the most precious gift I've ever received. They sat together by the fire, looking through the book of flowers, reminiscing about the years each bloom represented the birth of their children, the difficult winters, the abundant harvests, the quiet moments that had shaped their life together. 30 years of flowers, Yates marveled, his arm around Zara's shoulders. Who would have thought that day I started digging in the dirt would lead to all this? I wouldn't trade a single moment, Zara said, resting her head against his shoulder. Not one. As the fire burned low and Christmas Eve slipped into Christmas morning, they remained together, surrounded by the sleeping presence of their family and the memories of 3 decades of love that had bloomed from the garden Yates had planted beside the cabin, so Zara would always have flowers. Spring came again, as it always did, bringing with it new life and renewed purpose. The garden awakened from its winter sleep, green shoots pushing through the soil with determined vigor. Yates and Zara worked side by side as they had for over 30 years, preparing for another season of growth. Their 31st summer together brought an unexpected challenge. A prolonged drought threatened the garden they had nurtured for so long. Water became precious, each drop carefully rationed between their crops, livestock, and beloved flowers. We might lose some of it this year, Yates admitted one evening as they surveyed the struggling plants. We simply don't have enough water. Zara squeezed his hand. The garden has survived hard times before. The strongest plants will make it through and will rebuild next year. But Yates was determined not to let his creation wither. Rising before dawn each morning, he carried buckets from the creek to water the most vulnerable sections. Despite Zara's protests that he was working too hard for a man of his age, he persisted. This garden has never failed to bloom, he said stubbornly. I don't intend to let it start now. His dedication paid off. Though some plants were lost to the drought, the heart of the garden survived. When rain finally came in late August, bringing blessed relief to the parched land, new growth appeared almost immediately, as if the plants had simply been waiting for their chance. You see, Yates said triumphantly as they walked through the reviving garden after the first substantial rainfall. They're resilient, just like us. Zara looked at her husband, his face weathered by years in the sun. His back slightly stooped now, but his eyes still bright with the same determination that had carried them through decades of frontier life, and felt a rush of love so powerful it took her breath away. Just like us, she agreed softly. The drought of 1907 passed into memory, becoming another chapter in their shared story, another challenge overcome together. Life continued its steady pace, marked by the rhythms of the seasons and the milestones of their expanding family. In the spring of 1908, their first great-grandchild was born, a boy named Thomas, son of their granddaughter Catherine, who had married the previous year. Holding the infant in her arms, Zara marveled at the continuity of life, at the branches of family that had grown from the roots she and Yates had established. 4 generations, she whispered as the baby wrapped his tiny hand around her finger. Your great-grandfather started planting a garden before I even knew I loved him. Beside her, Yates touched the baby's downy head with gentle fingers, and that garden will still be blooming when he's old enough to plant his own. The notion of their legacy continuing through this child and the others who would follow filled them both with quiet joy. They had built something lasting not just in the garden or the ranch, but in the values they had passed to their children and grandchildren, in the love that had shaped their family. As they moved into their 6th decade together, changes came to their corner of Montana. The frontier was fading, replaced by progress and modernization. The town nearby grew larger, with automobiles gradually replacing horses on the streets. Their own ranch evolved with the times, adopting new farming techniques and equipment under Elizabeth's forward-thinking management. But through it all, the garden remained a constant, a place where time seemed to slow. Each spring brought the familiar anticipation of new growth, each summer the satisfaction of abundant blooms, each fall the gentle preparation for winter's rest. On a golden afternoon in late September 1910, Yates and Zara sat on their garden bench, enjoying the warmth of the autumn sun. At 75, Yates moved more slowly now, and Zara's once nimble fingers were stiffened with arthritis, but they still found joy in tending their creation together. "I've been thinking," Yates said, breaking a comfortable silence, "about that first summer, how desperate you were to save this place, how determined to honor your father by keeping it going." Zara nodded, remembering the fierce young woman she had been. "I was so focused on survival then. Just getting through each day. And now look at what you've built." Yates gestured toward the main house where several of their grandchildren were visiting. "An empire, almost. What we've built," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done it without you." Yates smiled, the familiar creases deepening around his eyes. "Oh, you would have managed. You're the strongest person I've ever known." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but it would have been a much harder, lonelier life." She took his weathered hand in hers. "You didn't just bring me flowers, Yates. You brought me partnership, joy, family. Best decision I ever made," he said simply, stopping here instead of continuing on. They sat together as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the garden they had nurtured for so many years. Neither spoke of the reality. They both acknowledged that they were in the autumn of their own lives, that the years ahead would be fewer than those behind. There was no need for such words between them. They had always understood that their time together, like the blooming of the garden, was precious precisely because it wasn't eternal. That winter was particularly harsh, with bitter cold and heavy snow that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Yates developed a persistent cough that worried Zara, though he dismissed her concern with his usual stoicism. "Just the cold getting into my chest," he insisted. "I'll be fine come spring." But when spring arrived, the cough remained. By May, when the garden was awakening once more, Yates's strength was clearly fading. The doctor who came from town spoke quietly to their children about age and pneumonia and preparing themselves. Zara refused to accept it. "He'll get better when he can be in the garden again," she insisted. The fresh air, the flowers, they've always restored him. On the first truly warm day of the season, their son and grandson helped Yates out to the garden, settling him in a comfortable chair they'd placed near his favorite roses. Zara sat beside him, holding his hand as he breathed in the scent of the blooms, his face turned toward the sun. "Beautiful," he murmured, his voice weaker but his eyes bright as they took in the garden. "Just as beautiful as that first year, more so," Zara said, squeezing his hand. "It's had 35 years to grow." They spent as much time in the garden as Yates's strength allowed over the following weeks. Sometimes he would doze in his chair while Zara read to him. Other times they would simply sit together, watching butterflies dance among the flowers or listening to the buzz of bees. On a perfect June morning, with the garden in full, glorious bloom, Yates asked to be taken to the original cabin preserved all these years as a reminder of their beginning. Inside, he asked for a moment alone with Zara. "I want you to know," he said when the others had left, his voice barely above a whisper, "that loving you has been the greatest joy of my life." Tears filled Zara's eyes. "And you have been the greatest joy of mine. Promise me something," he continued, his breathing labored. "Promise you'll keep the garden blooming." "I promise," she whispered, her heart breaking even as she spoke the words. "There will always be flowers, Yates smiled, his hand tightening briefly around hers. Then I'll always be with you. He died peacefully that night, with Zara beside him and the scent of the garden drifting through the open window. True to her word, she continued to tend the garden, though she accepted more help from their children and grandchildren now. It became a family endeavor, a living memorial to the man who had created it. The following spring, Zara added a special section to the garden, wildflowers similar to those Yates had first planted all those years ago. Simple blooms that spoke of beginnings, of hope taking root in new soil. Life continued its inevitable flow. Grandchildren married, more great-grandchildren were born, the ranch prospered under Elizabeth's guidance. Zara remained the matriarch, her mind sharp even as her body gradually weakened with age. And always, there was the garden evolving, growing, blooming season after season. Just as Yates had promised her when they were young, she always had flowers. On her 90th birthday, surrounded by 4 generations of family, Zara sat in the garden that had been the heart of her life with Yates. Though he had been gone for nearly 14 years, she felt his presence strongly in this place they had created together. "Tell us again, great-grandma," urged one of the youngest children, "about how great-grandpa planted the garden for you." Zara smiled, looking out at the expanse of flowers that had started as a small patch beside a lonely cabin. "It began in the spring of 1876, she said, her voice soft with memory. "A cowboy rode up to my door. The story had been told many times, had become part of their family mythology. But Zara never tired of sharing it, of keeping alive the memory of the man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness, planting a garden, so she would always have flowers." As she spoke, a butterfly alighted on a nearby bloom of vibrant monarch with wings like stained glass. Zara paused in her story, watching as it opened and closed its wings in the warm sunshine. "Your great-grandfather always said butterflies were the garden's way of showing off," she told the children. "A flower that could fly." The butterfly remained for a moment longer, then rose and drifted away on the summer breeze. Zara watched it go, a sense of peace settling over her. She had kept her promise to Yates. The garden still bloomed, would continue to bloom long after she joined him. And in that knowledge, she found comfort that the love they had shared, like the perennial flowers they had tended together, would return season after season, always finding its way back to the light.